The federal government is on the verge of making major regulatory changes to speed up major projects. Sources tell CBC News the details are coming any day now.
The important thing is that we respect the law, and the designation requires consultations in advance of designation. We're moving forward at speed, but we're doing it in the right way. Consultation with Indigenous partners, with provinces, with all stakeholders.
As the government speeds up projects, it's also propping up some struggling industries. This week, Industry Minister Mélanie Joly announced an additional $1.5 billion in support for steel, aluminum, and copper, all hard hit by U.S. tariffs. Alberta, meanwhile, is trying to put the lid on a massive voter data breach, but the questions are only adding up. And Pierre Poilievre tells a large gathering of Conservatives he's going to keep fighting for Canadians, but he's not going to change his style of combat. Our Reporter Roundtable is here. We've got Mia Rabson. She, of course, is the Deputy Parliamentary Bureau Chief at the Canadian Press. Joël Denis Bellevance is the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for La Presse. And Bob Fife looks a lot younger. In fact, he looks a lot like Aaron Wherry, the senior writer for CBC News. Bob is away, being honored in Toronto for his journalism career. JD, let's start with you. The stuff we're seeing on the economy and the trade front, I mean, more supports for steel, aluminum, and copper suggests not going to be resolved quick. But, you know, the U.S. auto sector sending letters to Jameson Greer saying, stop trying to help us. we like the way things work. What do you make of where things are going into this with regulatory change on the horizon?
Well, I think it's moving in the right direction for the government strategy that is, you know, sort of playing the clock, not pushing too much to get a rush into a deal, because the pieces are going in the right direction. The other court decision that was rendered today on the ability of the president to impose tariffs is another win for Canada.
The 10% global tariffs, for people who don't know,
exactly.
Deemed illegal by a trade court. Who knows what happens next time?
Yeah, it's probably going to go to the Supreme Court and we'll hear the same arguments. But it just shows that patience may have some, virtues. And I think that's the right thing to play. In the meantime, as you know, the industries are suffering, and that's why the government has announced that new support program on Monday. From the workers' perspectives, you know, it's hard, and if you lose your job or if your industry is hit by those tariffs, but that's the only game we can play right now that we are sure that we will win at the end of the day. Rushing to conclude a deal that is not, going to be worth the paper it's written on is not worth it. And that's, I think, the philosophy of the government right now.
Yeah, if my math is right, Mia, formal talks start about 2 weeks from today, and sometime between now and then, it seems like we're going to get the next step in the major, like they've got the big major projects legislation, the major projects office, a push and consultation process on other regulatory reform to speed things up is apparently coming.
Yeah, I mean, Dominic LeBlanc said that at a committee, I think it was last week, that they know that they need to do something to say so that all projects, not just the top few that the major projects office is commanding,
have 2 tiers, right?
That all of them were sort of reviewed in this 2-year time frame, and it's one of the biggest criticisms of the Canadian government. So this is all part and parcel of the Carney government's push to build big, build fast, whatever. Sorry, I probably got the slogan wrong. But so yeah, I mean, this is the court decision in the United States, I'm sure, has made the government today a little bit happy, although those tariffs are not the biggest problem for Canada. 10% was not a big deal, plus it only applied to goods that weren't in CUSMA. So it was a very small thing. It's the steel tariffs, it's the auto tariffs. Those are the ones that are really harmful. The steel industry in particular is hurting. They have many, many more requests. We probably are going to see more from the government for helping for the steel industry. But this is also a sign of the government sort of preparing things at home for a little bit of a longer fight with the United States. They've been waiting for these negotiations to actually start. We'll see. They haven't put a lot of cards on the table publicly, so we don't know a lot about what they're doing, but maybe things will get a little bit more clear in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, Aaron, the next thing we're waiting for is the clarity on this, but this falls into the category of focusing on the things that you can control if you're Mark Carney and his government, right?
In terms of the resource projects, yeah. I mean, I think we'll see what they come out with tomorrow. I think it's interesting that they're moving forward not with legislation, but with a consultation. I think if you go back even to the Harper government and when it made its major changes to environmental assessment laws, those were, I think, part of the reason they generated as much controversy as they did is because they were done through omnibus budget bills. Right. And so there was immediately a sense of something's being done here that should raise concern. And I think, maybe even going back to the Major Projects Office, this government moved first and then had to deal with backlash. And so in this case, it looks like they're trying to kind of open the process up at the start, see where people are at, see whether they have to make changes, and then move forward. I don't know. I mean, Mark Carney's had such a good 12 months politically, if you look at the polls, that I'm a bit hesitant to say that he could run into trouble on this particularly, because it seems like the Canadian public's willing to go along with him for a lot. Mm-hmm. But I do think starts to be some areas where he's going to have different groups of Canadians are going to see this differently, and how he navigates that, I think, is going to be interesting.
What is fascinating about the debate about pipelines or big projects, but namely pipelines, is that the word pipeline is no longer taboo in Canada. Used to be a word.
Parts of Canada still is.
Well, in Quebec, polls have shown that there's growing support for that kind of project because of what we're seeing with the United States, but also in Iran. And guess what? In Quebec, the biggest selling vehicle in Quebec is an F-150. The big gas guzzler.
It's the biggest selling, one of the biggest selling vehicles in all of Canada,
yeah,
right? Because a lot of Canadians don't live in the downtown cores.
Exactly, but it costs a lot of money. Now it's at $2 a liter to fill it up. It costs like at least $200. So I think you would like to have maybe one more pipeline that will maybe reduce the cost of filling your big F-150. But it's no longer taboo, and I think Mr. Carney can use that to his advantage. I think he helped, make sure that this is no longer taboo, and the debates have shifted dramatically in the last 16 months.
Or you can get an F-150 Lightning and just plug in your big pickup truck and go.
$80,000 and
look, I know, they're pricey. But look, another thing is like a lightning strike is what's happening in Alberta, Mia, with the data breach. The leak, let's flat out call it. Jason Kenney's personal information being displayed on a screen at a meeting of Alberta separatists. It was suggested to me earlier that Rachel Notley's information, that seems deliberate, I mean, what do you make of this? There's now police investigation, an Elections Alberta investigation, the Privacy Commissioner investigation on all of this, but 2.9 million voters had their information shared illegally and improperly, and all of this leading towards a possible referendum on the future of Alberta and Canada.
I think for many Canadians or whether people in general, this is like your worst nightmare, to have your information. You gave you this information so that you could vote and you could do your democratic duty, your civic duty, and then that trust was breached. And we are living at a time right now where trust in institutions has been falling for years. If you can't trust that the political parties are getting your information, there's a huge damage to that. And on top of that, it's coming from a group that's threatening to break Canada up. So there's a lot to unpack and to think about in terms of what's happened. The politics of it are difficult. The Alberta government, I think, has been trying to sort of play maybe both sides of this issue, not get too super involved or sort of support one side or the other. I'll be more interested to see what happens from the federal government and other parties as this discussion in Alberta heats up and maybe gets a little bit more real.
Yeah, when and if it gets on a ballot, gets certified and all of that.
Yeah, it feels like until now people are like, well, it's just sort of chatter, it's not going to happen. But if it becomes more real, I think you're going to start to see others have to start taking a stronger stance against it, including the Premier of Alberta.
Look, I don't know what's going through Mark Carney's head on this, Aaron, but as the guy who was the governor of the Bank of England the morning after Brexit, I think he knows the idea of maybe being too passive in a referendum is probably a poor choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably well understands that you can't predict how these things are going to go, and you can't take it for granted. I mean, I think he's got sort of two tracks. One is the MOU and trying to deal with, trying to find a policy agreement on energy and climate policy.
Proof points that it can work.
Yeah, something that you can, that is going to advance the Federalist cause instead of hurt it. And then I think, one would hope or presume that somewhere in the federal government they're having a discussion about what they do when this referendum starts. What does the No campaign look like? What does their involvement in that look like? How do they weigh in on it? Do they get involved directly? Do they, everything is going to be so magnified in a campaign like that they're going to have to think carefully about it. And I think the other piece of it is that even, to go to the Brexit comparison, even if the separation side loses, even if there's a no vote on this referendum, the impacts aren't going to suddenly go away. And so first of all, you're going to have what could be a very divisive campaign. And then you're potentially going to have to live with a world where, even if it's just 20% or 30% who vote yes, that's still 20 to 30%. You have to deal with the prospect of that.
Yep.
Where does Alberta politics go after that? And so,
what happens to Daniel Smith's coalition, Pierre Poilievre's Alberta coalition?
It's a
right?
huge. I think if there's one big thing on the calendar for the next 12 months or the next 6 months, it is that referendum. And just the fact that it's unlikely to win at this point, I think is kind of the least of the questions it raises.
Yeah. So JD, who drives the no bus, as they say in Quebec, right?
I don't know, but I think Jason Kenney is worried about that because he doesn't feel that he's got, Federalists defending the Federalist cause properly in Alberta. This week, the Prime Minister said that the Clarity Act will apply to the referendum exercise. What does it say? It says that Ottawa has to approve the question. So there will be a debate in the House of Commons about the validity of that question. That will be asked to do the people of Alberta. But already we've seen that this exercise has become a very messy affair with all the revelations about names of people being revealed and all that. Right. So that's almost ground for the government to reject any referendum before it does
That'd be tough to do. If they get the signatures and it complies with the law that Daniel Smith and her government put in place, it's tough for Ottawa.
The federal government still has to say whether the exercise was well conducted.
Yes.
Not only whether the question is clear, but also if the majority is clear enough. And they have to approve the question. So sooner or later, Ottawa will get its nose in this business.
That's a powder keg, though. You can just see that, right? You can just I know you need rules around these things because in a democracy, people can pursue these efforts, right?
The question that Mr. Carney will ask himself: what would Jean Chrétien do in those circumstances? And I'm told that Mr. Carney consults quite regularly Jean Chrétien, and this will probably become more regular on the national issue because it's coming to be flaring up in this fall.
The issues with the referendum in Alberta are different than they were the referendums in Quebec, and I think the idea
because of the framework, there's a framework,
but also like the reason and the push for separatism in Alberta is because they don't want Ottawa dictating to what they do. So to David's point, it's the powder keg for Ottawa to get involved in any way.
Now, right?
Is it like they have to be super careful because they could actually drive more people into that vote in a way that they'd have to be super careful about. But I do think you're going to start to see a little bit more from the federal government and from other political leaders across Canada as we inch closer to this becoming real.
Aaron, just a final point on this. The other thing that's really different, never mind just the framework from the last referendum, and as I talked about this with Jason Kenney, is the media ecosystem is different. Social media exists at scale. Foreign interference and influence exists at scale. Artificial intelligence is there. It's hard to hack a national Canadian election because of regionalism and multi-party and first past the post, but a binary yes-no referendum, you can influence that, as we saw with Brexit.
Yeah, I think it's a big question to be asked going forward, but there's been obviously these reports by experts coming out talking about the interference they're already seeing. I think it's an interesting question going forward is whether the structures in Alberta are set up to deal with this. We have the bodies at the federal level to detect foreign interference and report it, and there's processes and protocols and so on and so forth. So I'm interested to see how Alberta sort of deals with that. And then I get, it is going to, because regardless of what's going on in Alberta, the question will eventually land back with the federal government of how you engage with this. And I think it's, Jason Kenney had some comments in another interview where he talked about wanting to hear more from the Federalist voices. I think to a large degree, those voices have to come from within Alberta for now. Yeah. I don't know, yes, Mark Carney will say he grew up in Alberta, but I don't know that Mark Carney going to Alberta and saying, you guys should vote against this is necessarily the leading voice you want on this. And so who are going to be the Federalist voices in Alberta that are going to lead this charge? Where are they going to come from, and sort of how organized are they going to be? I think that's sort of the next thing I'm looking for is what does that no campaign look like? Yeah,
I mean, there was Jean Charest, Jean Chrétien, there was a lot of prominent Quebec figures last time around. Look, I want to quickly get to what Pierre Poilievre said today, because Alberta MP, Alberta guy, he was speaking at the Canada Strong and Free conference today here in Ottawa, one of the biggest gatherings of Conservatives on an annual basis. It used to be called the Manning Conference. Here's a sample of what the opposition leader had to say.
And that is ultimately what we have today, the club of liberal elites who dominate this town and every microphone in it. They dominate the political panels and talk shows. They control the airwaves. And that is exactly why they want to stop and change me. They do not want anything to change in the country. They say that we should just join the club, accept the status quo. blend in. But that would mean leaving behind the 8.3 million Canadians, the record-smashing 8.3 million Canadians who voted for us. They voted for us to fight for them. And some people have accused me of being a fighter. But that's because some things are actually worth fighting for.
Okay, we only got a couple of minutes here, but JD, the through line in a lot of this was Pierre Poilievre is going to continue to be Pierre Poilievre. He's not changing. He has rejected the suggestions coming from a lot of pundits that he's got to be a different guy. He is who he is, and he's going to live and die with that.
Yeah, and I think he's thinking that he would be reneging on his own history if he does that. So
Yeah.
that's why he's going to be holding his own as Pierre Poilievre going forward. We'll see whether it pays off. You know, government defeats themselves, as we know. Maybe Mark Carney will become unpopular at some point, and Mr. Poilievre will benefit from that. But for now, it looks like it's going to be a long, long road.
Mia, what do you make of what we heard from Mr. Poilievre?
I think he's clinging to that 8.3 million figure that he in the votes that they got in the last election. The polls suggest right now they wouldn't get 8.3 million votes, and I think that's the question they have to ask: is not only did we not get the government we thought we were going to get a year ago, but why have people left us even more so in the last year than that we've continued to sort of bleed support. At the same time, he is who he is, and I think most politicians do their best when they are allowed to be who they are, and trying to be someone you're not. I can think of maybe a former Conservative leader who dabbled in that for a little bit. Didn't work out so well. So I think being who he is and standing up for what he believes in is probably the best route to go in general. But they do need to ask some questions about how they possibly come up against a government that is somewhat popular and dealing with policies that are very similar to their own.
Yeah, I mean, we only got 60 seconds here, Aaron, but like on a very human level, if you've risen to this level in politics on a core set of beliefs and everyone's telling you got to change, you want to be able to look at yourself in the mirror when you shave in the morning. It's like, I am doing what I truly believe in, and that is the path Mr. Poilievre seems very intent on following.
To be honest, I've always thought the idea of a pivot in politics is a bit silly, as if you could sort of change the way you talk and therefore render null and void everything you did up until that moment. I think it's an interesting jiu-jitsu move on his part to say, well, it's all these liberal elites who want me to change, and I'm going to fight back against them by sticking to who I am. I think it's a side effect of the Liberals moving into a majority that he can sort of go back to being the fighter,
Yes.
And take a tougher line. But I think the truth of it is, to Mia's point, the future is not necessarily in his hands. He needs the Carney government to fail. He needs the Carney government to be unpopular. And in that respect, he kind of has to wait and see how things go. He's not controlling the agenda anymore.
Yeah. Well, look, Michelle Cadario, who's on the show quite regularly and worked for Paul Martin in his office, she said, Liberals don't want us to change. Pierre, keep being Pierre. They feel pretty good about the dynamic right now. We'll see. Things can change. He was, had them down and beaten not that long ago. Okay, we are out of time, unlike the Leader of the Opposition who still has time. Mia Rabson, JD Bellavance, and Aaron Weir, our Reporter Roundtable.